Hello. In this episode of the Lens blog, I want to focus on the recent G7 meeting and specifically why no compelling action was really taken on climate change. Now, to be balanced, there has been progress on the climate change agenda, with many nations committing to significant reductions in their carbon footprint. But everybody recognises that the scale of the commitments and the urgency with which they need to be delivered will not be enough to avert the depth of the crisis, and that more action is needed. So climate change was firmly on the G7 agenda, but actually little came out. And I want to talk about the psychological reasons for why we as humans find it much harder to embrace the climate change emergency than other crises such as the COVID epidemic. And these psychological biases explain why we may not take the climate change crisis as seriously as we ought to, but it also explains why politicians and leaders don't feel necessarily that compelled to act in a way that addresses the size and scale of the issue. There are three areas that I want to point to from a psychological perspective. The first is that the climate change threat is poorly suited to activate our neurologically wired evolutionary apparatus for detecting risk. We are much more attuned to attending to and solving immediate and tangible risks than more ephemeral or long-term risks. The whole language around climate change, such as global warming, does not imply a sense of immediate threat. The 1.5 or 2 degrees size of global warming also doesn't conjure up a real image of the devastating consequences that lie behind that figure. And the dates of 2050 or up to 2100 create a sense of a crisis far away. As a consequence, in human life, the urgent always crowds out the important. This happens in business, in our personal lives, and in all areas of routine human activity. And that's one of the reasons that explains the relative neglect of this agenda. A second effect is something called the bystander and the free rider effect. This refers to the fact that when there is a problem and multiple actors need to act together, often people hold back, feeling that somebody else should go first. There is also the free rider problem, which is if I'm going to make sacrifices and other people are going to benefit who are not making those sacrifices, then I'm not that motivated to make those sacrifices. Now, this happens at an individual level around climate change, but it also happens at a national country level. Countries are reluctant to be the first movers, and they're reluctant to take action if others they feel will not follow suit. And there's a real fear of a free rider problem in international relations. The third area is actually rational choice. The truth of the climate change crisis is that it affects different populations differently. Older people will have to live less long with the crisis that's emerging, and it will influence much more significantly the lives of younger people. Yet our leaders are predominantly older generation, and so their actual incentives to take costs now in their political fortunes or in their economic well-being for gains for another group of people is significantly lower. And that rational choice making, I think, influences different strata of society having a very different agendas. It's very interesting that the G7 leaders were all 60 or plus, but virtually all the protesters outside complaining about climate change were young people, mostly in their teens or 20s. So, what do we do about this? Well, firstly, I think being aware of these biases in ourselves, managing them, and ensuring that they do not affect our kind of political decisions or our personal decisions. The second is to just avoid the bystander and free rider effect. That is, take whatever action we can at our level to help this emergency, and not just hide behind the fact that our politicians aren't stepping up to the plate, or other people aren't, or other countries aren't. It's a small start, but I think recognising some of these areas may help us move in a more urgent way. And these are the factors, I think, that have been absent with the COVID crisis, and that has meant that the world has reacted much more sharply in managing that than climate change. Yet the latter has equally important and potentially devastating impact on human life and on our life on this planet, as a COVID crisis does. Thank you.